What you're about to hear really happened. In 1932, the Australian Army was sent to the Western Australian wheat belt with machine guns. Their mission? To wage war on emus. To understand why, you have to see the world they lived in. East and southeast of Perth stretches a vast, semi-arid belt of land, the wheat belt. By the early 20th century, it had been opened up by railways, soldier settlement schemes, and government policy. After the First World War, returned servicemen and other settlers were given land there. Wheat was king. Farms were large, mechanization was growing, and the landscape had been transformed from native vegetation into seas of grain. But the climate was harsh, Mediterranean style, with hot, dry summers and winter rain that could fail. Droughts were common, and in the late 1920s and early 1930s, economic collapse met climatic stress. The Great Depression drove wheat prices down and debt up. For many farmers, the wheat belt was a place of hope that had turned into a place of struggle. In the middle of this stood Campion, a small settlement in the heart of the wheat belt, typical of the district. Rail and road links, farmers, and grain. Perth, the state capital, was the administrative hub. From there, state and federal agencies made policy, and eventually, the decision to send in the army. The landscape wasn't just a backdrop, it was an actor. Open crops, limited water, and remnant vegetation drew wildlife, including emus. When the birds moved in during their seasonal migrations, they found grain, water points, and broken or absent fencing. The stage was set for a collision between settler agriculture, native wildlife, economic desperation, and the state. That collision would be remembered as the Emu War, and it would become one of the strangest episodes in Australian history. So how did it come to this? How did farmers and politicians decide that the answer to flocks of emus was the army? The pressure had been building for years. Soldier settlement had put people on marginal land. When prices fell and drought bit, any extra blow, including emus, felt like a crisis. Reports of crop damage in the Campion area and across the wheat belt piled up. Trampling, grazing, loss of grain. The numbers weren't scientifically measured, they were asserted by farmers and repeated in the press and in Parliament. Whatever the true scale, the perception was real. Emus were a plague, and the government had to act. Local members of Parliament took up the cause. They received letters and petitions from constituents and pressed the federal government to deploy the army. The argument was simple. The emus were a menace. The farmers were already suffering, and the army had the weapons and the manpower to reduce the threat. There were other options: bounties, coordinated civilian shooting, better fencing subsidies, or simply accepting a certain level of damage. But the government, under political pressure and with no clear long-term pest policy, chose the military option. It was unprecedented. There was no real precedent for using the army against wildlife in Australia. But in 1932, in a society that expected the state to protect settlers and that hadn't yet learned the limits of force against mobile wildlife, the decision was made. The press had already reported on the emu menace. Once the story was public, inaction could be portrayed as indifference. So the order went out. A small force, officers and gunners with machine guns, would be sent to the Campion area. The farmers would get their help. What happened next would prove that the wrong tool had been chosen, and would turn a desperate measure into a national joke. The voices that were missing from this story, those of indigenous people with long knowledge of emus and the land, would not be heard in the official record. But the war was on. In late 1932, the detachment arrived. They set up in the Campion area, where large flocks of emus had been reported. The plan was straightforward. Position the machine guns where the birds gathered, near water or in open paddocks, and opened fire when a flock was in range. The first engagement revealed the flaw. When the guns opened up, the emus didn't stand and fight. They broke and ran. They were fast. They could hit 50 kilometers an hour or more, and they scattered in unpredictable directions. The gunners found it nearly impossible to keep sustained fire on a single group because within seconds, the group had dissolved. The result was a relatively small number of kills. Figures vary in the sources, but the message was clear. Machine guns, however devastating in human warfare, were a poor match for large, mobile birds in open country. The emus didn't need to win a battle. They just had to run. And they did. There were more operations. Tactics were adjusted. Some birds were killed. But the overall impact on emu numbers and on crop damage was limited. The military could claim partial success. They could not claim victory. For the farmers who watched or heard the news, the result was a letdown. The quick fix they'd hoped for hadn't materialized. For the press, the story was already shifting. Headlines began to play on the idea of a war against birds. The image of soldiers firing at fleeing emus and of the emus winning by running away was too good to ignore. The campaign was both a real military operation and a public spectacle, and the spectacle was starting to overshadow the seriousness of what had brought it about. Weather, terrain, ammunition, and logistics all constrained what the detachment could do. But the core problem was simpler. The weapon and the target were mismatched. By the time the government and the military faced that fact, the legend of the Emu War had already begun. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Hit the like button to show your support and turn on notifications so you never miss a deep dive into history. Your support helps us bring more accurate, fascinating stories straight to you every week. The campaign did not last long. Within weeks, the results were in. The tactic was ineffective and unsustainable. The army was withdrawn. Pest control was handed back to the state and to farmers. Fencing, bounties, civilian shooting. No second deployment was ordered. The experiment was over. In Parliament, there was reckoning. Politicians who had pushed for the deployment now had to explain or defend it. The press had already turned the story into comedy. Editorials and cartoons treated the war as absurdity, not always fairly to the farmers who had asked for help, but effectively. The dominant memory that would stick was not the economic crisis or the crop damage. It was the image of Australia sending the army against birds and losing. The policy lesson was clear. Military force was not an appropriate or effective response to emu damage in the wheat belt. In the decades that followed, governments relied on bounties, fencing, and civilian shooting, and eventually, in many areas, on greater protection of emus. The Emu War was a last, failed attempt to treat the emu problem as a military one. It was also the moment the story became a joke that Australians would tell about themselves for generations. So what do we do with the Emu War today? It's a punchline. It's also a real lesson. First, military force is the wrong tool for sustained pest management. It's expensive, politically fraught, and ecologically naive. Second, policy has to be grounded in an understanding of the species and the landscape, something that was largely absent in 1932. Third, the voices that were missing, indigenous people with long knowledge of emus and the land, remind us that this conflict was part of a larger history of colonization and the marginalization of indigenous environmental knowledge. And fourth, the line between tragedy and farce is thin. For the farmers, the episode was serious. For the public, it became a joke. A full account holds both truths. The Emu War left a modest policy legacy and a large cultural one. It endures because it's funny, because it's true in its outlines, and because it speaks to something recognizable about human overreach and the limits of control. It shows how the media can shape memory, how a story can be framed as crisis and then reframed as comedy. And it invites us to think about how we tell history. Who gets to speak, what we emphasize, and what we leave out. The emus didn't write this history. The farmers didn't write it alone. We write it, and in writing it, we make choices. The Emu War is not over. It lives on in memory, in humor, and in the ongoing work of understanding who we are and how we relate to the land and its creatures. The Emu War of 1932 was a small event. It lasted a few weeks. It involved a handful of soldiers and an unknown number of emus. It left no one dead in the way that wars usually do. But it was also a large event, large in its symbolic weight, in its hold on the imagination, and in the lessons it carries. It's a story about the limits of force, the power of the press, the desperation of farmers, and the silence of indigenous voices. It's a story that Australians tell about themselves and that the world tells about Australia. It's both a joke and a tragedy, both absurd and serious. If you want to go deeper, the full narrative, the sources, the silences, and the way the legend was made, check out the book or the series in the description. We've put together government and military records, press coverage, and a bibliography so you can follow the trail yourself. And if this kind of history matters to you, the kind that takes the absurd seriously and the serious with a dose of humility, like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what you think the Emu War really means. Thanks for watching. There's so much more history to explore, so stay tuned for our next videos. We'll dive into even more fascinating stories from Europe and around the world. And of course, subscribe, like, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode.